Snoop Dogg dressed up as a homeless man and went to Central Park. The police reaction will shock you. What started as a social experiment turned into a viral scandal that shook the system. What happens when a hip-hop legend decides to test justice? See for yourself. This day changed everything. The afternoon air in Central Park was crisp, the sun casting long shadows through the towering trees. Families strolled along the winding paths, joggers weaved through the crowds, and tourists snapped pictures of the Bethesda fountain. The city's heartbeat was steady, unbothered by the single figure sitting quietly on a weathered wooden bench near the fountain. He was dressed in a tattered coat, the edges frayed, his hood pulled low over his face. His jeans were worn, his sneakers mismatched and scuffed. A brown paper bag, crumpled and slightly stained, rested beside him. Snoop Dogg, one of the most recognizable faces in the world, sat in complete anonymity. He had spent hours perfecting the look. His stylist had worked tirelessly to make him appear truly destitute. He had even spent the past 2 days studying the mannerisms of the homeless population in different areas of New York City, taking note of how they held themselves, how they responded to passersby, and how the world treated them. Today, he wasn't a rap icon, a businessman, or a legend. He was just another forgotten man on the streets. His heart pounded, but not from fear. This wasn't his first social experiment, but it was by far his boldest. He wanted to see firsthand how authority treated the powerless, how the public reacted to those they considered invisible. Hidden cameras were already in place, positioned at strategic angles around the park, and his microphone was subtly wired beneath his coat. A small team was monitoring everything remotely, ensuring that every moment was recorded. As he took a slow bite of the sandwich from his paper bag, he sensed the moment before it happened. The sharp sound of tires crunching against the gravel. The distant but deliberate hum of an approaching police cruiser. Showtime. The black and white NYPD vehicle slowed as it entered the parking lot just beyond the trees. 2 officers stepped out. One was young, his short-cropped hair and stiff posture marking him as a man still eager to prove himself. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, and his hand rested near the baton on his hip. The other officer was older, his uniform slightly rumpled, his face worn with the weight of too many years on the job. His expression was one of quiet exhaustion. The younger officer, Martinez, scanned the park with sharp eyes, his gaze quickly locking onto Snoop. He nudged his partner, Higgins, and muttered under his breath, "Another one." Higgins sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's a part, Martinez. People sit in parks." Martinez scoffed. "Not people like that. This place is turning into a damn homeless camp." Higgins didn't respond, but his silence was telling. They started walking toward the bench, their boots crunching against the gravel. Snoop remained still, his gaze fixed on the ground, his hands folded around his sandwich. His heart rate didn't change. He had expected this, hoped for it even. Martinez reached the bench first, stopping directly in front of Snoop. He towered over him, his stance rigid. "You can't sit here all day," he said flatly. Snoop took another bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly. He didn't look up. Martinez's expression tightened. "I said you can't sit here all day. You got somewhere to go." This time, Snoop swallowed and looked up, his head casting a shadow over his face. His voice was calm, measured. "Just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," Martinez snapped. "People like you make this place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." Higgins shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Snoop tilted his head slightly. "I didn't realize sitting on a bench was a crime." Martinez's jaw tightened. "What's your name?" Snoop hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Calvin." "Last name?" Snoop exhaled through his nose, watching Martinez's face. "Broadus." Martinez smirked. "Calvin Broadus, huh? You a rapper in your spare time?" Snoop didn't react. He simply set his sandwich down beside him and reached into his coat pocket. Both officers tensed, Martinez's hand instinctively moving to his baton. Higgins, despite his apparent reluctance, took a step forward. Slowly, Snoop pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to Martinez. The officer flipped it open, scrutinizing the ID inside. The photo matched, but the man sitting before him looked nothing like the polished image on the card. His frown deepened. "What are you doing here, Broadus?" Martinez asked. Why aren't you at a shelter? Snoop shrugged. I like the fresh air. Martinez let out a sharp breath. That a crime too? Snoop added. Higgins finally stepped in, crossing his arms. Look, man, you're not doing anything illegal, but we can make it uncomfortable for you, Martinez interrupted. Snoop's fingers twitched slightly, but he kept his face neutral. He wasn't surprised, only disappointed. He reached for his sandwich again, lifting it deliberately to his mouth. From a few feet away, a woman walking her dog had stopped to watch. She hesitated for a moment before speaking up. He's not hurting anyone, she called. Why are you bothering him? Martinez turned sharply. Ma'am, this is none of your concern. This is a public park, she shot back. He has as much right to be here as anyone else. Higgins raised a placating hand. Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Please move along. She muttered something under her breath, but pulled her dog's leash and walked away, throwing one last glance over her shoulder. Snoop watched her go, then dusted crumbs off his lap. Am I free to go? He asked. You're not under arrest, Higgins said, ignoring the warning glance Martinez shot him. But maybe you should find somewhere else to sit. Snoop nodded, standing slowly. The officers seemed surprised at how tall he was. He adjusted his coat, letting the hood shift slightly. A lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. Have a nice day, he said, his voice low but pointed. Martinez scowled as Snoop walked away, his paper bag tucked under his arm. You see the way he looked at me? He muttered to his partner. Guy thinks he's better than us. Let it go. Higgins sighed. He's not worth the paperwork. But Martinez wasn't convinced. His jaw tightened as he watched Snoop disappear down the path. Something about him didn't sit right. He didn't like the way the man had handled himself. Too calm, too calculated. Like he was in control of the situation. Like he knew something they didn't. He turned back to the cruiser, his mind racing. I don't trust him. Higgins rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. He had learned not to waste energy on Martinez's paranoia. But as they climbed back into the car, neither of them noticed the small red light on a nearby lamppost, one of the hidden cameras capturing every moment of their encounter. Snoop wasn't just walking away. The game had only just begun. Snoop Dogg walked further into Central Park, his steps slow and deliberate. He had expected a confrontation, but the intensity of Officer Martinez's scrutiny intrigued him. The officer wasn't just following protocol. He had taken a personal interest in making Snoop feel unwelcome. That was exactly what Snoop wanted. He reached another bench, this one tucked away near a cluster of oak trees. He settled down, setting his paper bag beside him. The air was still, the rustling of leaves barely audible over the distant hum of the city. For a while, he was left alone. Joggers passed by, occasionally glancing at him, their expressions a mixture of indifference and discomfort. A couple of teenagers on bikes slowed down, nudging each other and whispering before pedaling away. Snoop knew exactly what they were thinking. Then the inevitable happened. The police cruiser rolled up again, slower this time. Officer Martinez stepped out first, his eyes scanning the area before locking onto Snoop. His partner, Higgins, followed, though his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. You again, Martinez said, striding toward the bench. Couldn't find another park to loiter in? Snoop looked up, his expression unreadable. Didn't realize sitting was a crime. Martinez's jaw tightened. It's not. But you're still here, still acting suspicious. Higgins sighed. Martinez, come on. Martinez ignored him, taking a step closer. What's in the bag? Snoop didn't flinch. Lunch. Prove it. Raising an eyebrow, Snoop picked up the bag and held it out. Martinez snatched it, peering inside. He frowned at the neatly wrapped sandwich, apple, and water bottle. That all? He asked skeptically. Snoop nodded. Unless you think I'm hiding something under the apple. Higgins exhaled sharply, the closest thing to a laugh he had allowed himself. Martinez, drop it. We got better things to do. But Martinez wasn't ready to let go. You got ID? Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out the same worn wallet, handing it over. Martinez flipped it open, his frown deepening. This ID doesn't exist in the system, he said. Snoop tilted his head. That sounds like a problem with your system. Martinez's eyes narrowed. Or a problem with your ID. Higgins crossed his arms. Martinez, if the guy hasn't done anything, we don't have probable cause. Martinez's grip on the wallet tightened. People don't just sit around in parks like this unless they're up to something. Snoop leaned back slightly, watching him. Define people like this. Martinez hesitated for half a second too long. Higgins groaned. That's it. We're done here. Martinez's frustration was palpable, but he reluctantly handed the wallet back. Just don't hang around here all day. Snoop took his time putting his wallet away. I'll keep that in mind. The officers turned and walked back to their cruiser. Higgins looked relieved. Martinez, however, kept glancing over his shoulder. He wasn't letting this go. As soon as they drove off, Snoop exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper bag. They'd be back, and when they returned, he'd be ready. Snoop remained seated, his mind working through every detail of the encounter. The way Martinez reacted, the aggression in his voice, the way Higgins hesitated before stepping in. It was a pattern, one Snoop had seen before. He knew how men like Martinez operated. As expected, it didn't take long for them to return. The sound of boots on gravel signaled their arrival before Snoop even lifted his head. This time, Martinez approached with even more purpose. Higgins followed, but his reluctance was evident. You're still here, Martinez said, his voice edged with irritation. Snoop didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the officer's impatience to grow. Didn't realize there was a time limit, Snoop finally said. Martinez crossed his arms. You got an answer for everything, don't you? I try. Higgins sighed. Martinez, what's the point? The point, Martinez snapped, is that he's playing us. Snoop tilted his head. Playing you how? You're acting like you've got nothing to lose, Martinez shot back. Nobody sits this calm unless they're hiding something. Snoop's gaze was steady. Or maybe I've just been through worse. Martinez's lip curled. You think you're clever? Snoop didn't answer. He just smiled, slow, knowing. Martinez's hand twitched toward his baton, but before he could act, Higgins stepped between them. That's enough, Higgins said firmly. We're not doing this. He's hiding something, Martinez insisted. You have nothing, Higgins countered. No probable cause, no crime. We leave. Martinez's fists clenched, but he knew he was outnumbered. He shot one last glare at Snoop before turning away. As the officers left, Snoop reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device. A tiny red light blinked at him. The live stream was still going, capturing everything. This was far from over. The footage had already started spreading online. Viewers watched as Martinez repeatedly harassed a man doing nothing but sitting on a bench. Comments flooded in, calling out the clear bias, the unnecessary aggression. The next morning, news stations began picking up the story. Rapper Snoop Dogg conducts social experiment, exposes police bias in viral video. Within hours, the video had millions of views. Public figures weighed in. Hashtags like hashtag Snoop vs. System and hashtag police bias began trending. Protesters started gathering at Central Park, sitting on benches with signs that read, "We belong here." Officer Martinez wasn't just in trouble. He was the face of the very problem Snoop had set out to expose. And the world was watching. Snoop Dogg sat on the same bench, calm, collected, watching the events unfold exactly as he had anticipated. His live stream had already gone viral, and though he wasn't checking his phone, he knew millions of people were tuned in, witnessing the way Officer Martinez had handled their interaction. The internet was ablaze with comments, hashtags, and debates. Some people were outraged at the blatant profiling. Others questioned the necessity of the experiment. But one thing was certain, the world was watching. Officer Martinez, however, was unaware of just how deep in trouble he was. As he sat in his cruiser, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his partner Higgins let out a heavy sigh. "This is getting out of hand," Higgins muttered. "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." Martinez scoffed, his grip tightening. "You saw how he looked at me, Higgins? Like he was testing me. I don't like being tested." "That's because you failed," Higgins said flatly. Martinez turned his head sharply, his nostrils flaring, but Higgins didn't back down. "We had no reason to keep pushing him. We weren't responding to a complaint. He wasn't breaking any laws. And now this thing is spiraling out of control. You feel that?" That's pressure, Martinez. Someone higher up is going to see this. Martinez clenched his jaw. He hated feeling powerless, hated the idea that he was the one being observed instead of the other way around. He could sense it now. His gut told him that something was off about this entire situation. Why was this man so calm? Why was he still sitting there? Higgins continued, his voice softer now. Look, man, we can still walk away from this. If we keep pushing, it's going to look bad, and you know it. But Martinez was already tuning him out. His pride was hurt. He didn't like being challenged, and something about Calvin Broadus, if that was even his real name, set off alarm bells in his head. No, he finally said, shaking his head. I want to know who he really is. I don't buy his story. Higgins threw up his hands in frustration. You're making this personal, and that's exactly how you get yourself into trouble. But Martinez had already made up his mind. He grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need another ID verification on a Calvin Broadus. Something about this isn't adding up. A brief pause, then a crackle of static. Unit 12, we already ran that name. No records found. Martinez's jaw clenched. Then run it again. Higgins shook his head. You're obsessed. Martinez ignored him. His eyes were locked on Snoop, who still sat there, seemingly unfazed. Something wasn't right, and he was going to figure out what. Meanwhile, back at Snoop's production headquarters, his team watched the situation unfold with intense focus. The camera feeds were clear, capturing every moment in high definition. The analytics were through the roof. This was turning into one of the biggest viral social experiments ever conducted. Comments were flying in thousands per second. This is why we need police reform. They really think they can just harass people for sitting? The way this officer is acting is terrifying. Snoop's manager, Trey, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. Man, this is blowing up bigger than we thought. We're at 2.3 million live viewers right now, and climbing. One of the tech team members, Angie, turned around from her multiple screens. We should prepare a statement. If this keeps going, media outlets are going to start reaching out. Trey nodded. Yeah, but let's wait until Martinez screws up one more time. He's too deep in this now to back out without embarrassing himself. They turned back to the monitors, watching as Martinez exited the cruiser once again. This time, his entire demeanor was different. His movements were stiffer, his breathing deeper. The way he approached Snoop was filled with an almost tangible frustration. You're still here, Martinez said, his voice sharp. Snoop looked up, an eyebrow slightly raised. Like I said, I like the fresh air. Martinez wasn't in the mood for games. I need you to come with us. For what? Snoop asked, still calm. Am I being detained? Martinez hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Higgins, who shook his head. You can't do this, Higgins warned. We got nothing on him. But Martinez ignored him. I need you to answer some questions down at the station. Snoop exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? Martinez's patience snapped. Get up. Snoop stayed seated. You're making a mistake. Martinez reached down, grabbing his arm. But before he could pull Snoop up, a shout rang out from behind them. Hey, leave him alone. Both officers turned to see a small crowd gathering. People had been watching from afar, but now they were stepping forward, their phones raised. He didn't do anything. This is harassment. The tension in the air was suffocating. Martinez felt the walls closing in. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of the situation without looking weak. His fingers twitched on Snoop's sleeve, but then he let go, taking a step back. Snoop finally stood, adjusting his coat. Now, he said, his voice carrying through the park, we see the problem. Martinez swallowed hard, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the air. Officers, stand down. A woman in a crisp suit approached, her presence exuding authority. Her NYPD badge was clipped to her belt, and her face was unreadable. Captain Monroe, Higgins muttered, instantly recognizing her. Martinez stiffened. Captain, I was just making a scene, she finished for him. She turned to Snoop, studying him before nodding slightly. Mr. Broadus, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. Snoop simply nodded. I appreciate that. Monroe's gaze hardened as she turned back to Martinez. We'll be discussing this later. For now, You and Officer Higgins are dismissed." Martinez looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at Monroe's expression told him that would be a bad idea. His face burned with humiliation as he turned and walked away, Higgins following close behind. As the officers disappeared, Monroe took a step closer to Snoop. "You played this well." Snoop smiled slightly. "I didn't play anything. I just sat on a bench." Monroe chuckled. "The department will be making a statement. If you want to be part of the conversation, let me know." Snoop nodded. "I just might do that." As Monroe walked away, the crowd erupted into applause, cheering as Snoop turned back toward them, his face lit with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was the beginning of something bigger. Snoop Dogg remained standing for a moment as the applause from the crowd rippled through the park. He let the moment breathe, feeling the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The live stream was still rolling, capturing every second. His team was undoubtedly watching, tracking the numbers, watching the comments flood in. The experiment had officially reached its boiling point, but Snoop knew this wasn't over. Not yet. As Captain Monroe disappeared down the path, the crowd slowly began to dissipate, though a few curious onlookers lingered, murmuring among themselves, their eyes flicking between Snoop and the empty space where the officers had stood. Some approached, offering nods of solidarity, a few even patting him on the back. "That was some crazy SH*T, man," one young man in a hoodie said, shaking his head. "They really thought they could get away with that." Snoop just offered a small smile. "They always do, until someone makes them stop." A woman holding her phone up approached, still filming. "Snoop, what's next? You gonna take this further?" Snoop exhaled slowly, tilting his head slightly. "This ain't about me," he said, his voice even. "This about everybody who don't got the cameras on him. If this is what they do to someone like me, imagine what happens when the world ain't watching." The woman nodded, lowering her phone. "That's real," she murmured before stepping back into the dispersing crowd. Snoop glanced around, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone for the first time since the experiment started. A flood of notifications filled the screen, messages from Trey, Angie, his entire team. He tapped into the group chat. "Trey, Bureau, 6.5 M live viewers. This is insane." Angie, CNN, NBC, and ABC already reaching out for a statement. "We need to respond ASAP." Trey, "You want to do a press conference? Or are we letting the internet do its thing for now?" Snoop thought for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before he typed out a simple response. "Snoop, let the fire burn a little longer. We make our move soon." He locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He needed a moment to himself before stepping back into the chaos that awaited him outside this park. He turned back toward the bench, sitting down again, elbows resting on his knees, staring out at the quieting park. The calm didn't last long. A shadow fell across him. "You mind if I sit?" Snoop looked up and saw Captain Monroe standing there, her expression unreadable. He gestured toward the bench, and she sat down beside him, resting her hands on her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You knew this was going to blow up, didn't you?" Monroe finally said. Snoop smirked slightly. "I had a feeling." She nodded, exhaling. "Martinez is done," she said bluntly. "Higgins will probably keep his job, but he's got some explaining to do." Snoop didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, his eyes still on the path ahead of them. "I don't expect you to trust me," Monroe continued. "But I want you to know, not all of us are like him." Snoop finally turned his head slightly, looking at her. "I know," he said, "but enough of y'all are." She didn't argue. She just sat with his words, letting them settle between them. After another pause, Monroe reached in her own pocket and pulled out a card. She handed it to him. "My direct line," she said. "If you ever want to have a real conversation about how we can make things better, I am listening." Snoop looked at the card for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. "We'll see," he said. Monroe nodded, standing up. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Broadus." Snoop watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the park's winding paths. His phone buzzed again. More notifications. More noise. He finally stood up, stretching, adjusting his coat. He glanced at the bench one last time before heading toward the park exit, his next move already forming in his mind. The game had only just begun. Snoop Dogg walked out of Central Park, the weight of the moment still heavy on his shoulders. The city was alive, cars honking, people moving, conversations buzzing in every direction. He pulled his hood up, keeping his head low as he moved through the streets, feeling the eyes of those who had recognized him lingering longer than usual. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he left the park. Every major news outlet was covering the story. Social media was flooded with debates, hashtags, clips from the live stream replaying on loop. He knew this wasn't just another viral moment. This was something bigger. As he turned down a quieter street, a familiar black SUV was waiting at the curb. The back door opened, and Trey leaned out. "You ready?" he asked. Snoop exhaled and got in, the door shutting behind him. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but electric. Angie was sitting in the front passenger seat, her phone pressed to her ear, rapidly speaking to someone about interview requests. Trey was scrolling through his laptop, the glow from the screen reflecting in his eyes. "We're at over 10 million views on the original live stream," Trey said, still not looking up. "And that's just YouTube. TikTok's on fire with this. Twitter's split down the middle. You got people calling you a hero, others calling it a stunt, but the biggest thing is everyone's talking." Snoop leaned back against the leather seat, rubbing his hands together. "Good," he murmured. "Let him talk." Trey finally looked up. "What's the move? Press conference? Statement? Or we let it ride?" Snoop was quiet for a moment, considering. "We don't rush," he finally said. "We let them stew. The longer they talk, the more pressure they put on the department." Angie turned slightly in her seat. "Speaking of that," she said, hanging up her call, "Captain Monroe reached out. She's willing to meet privately, off record. She says the department's already feeling the heat." Snoop smirked. "I bet they are." Trey exhaled sharply. "You trust her?" Snoop shrugged. "I don't trust nobody in a badge. But I trust pressure. And right now, she's feeling it." Angie nodded. "So, we take the meeting?" Snoop thought for a beat, then nodded. "Yeah, but not at their turf. She comes to us." Angie was already dialing back, setting it up. Trey kept scrolling, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am, Martinez is done. He's been suspended pending investigation, but the department ain't outright throwing him under the bus yet." "They will," Snoop said, watching the city lights blur past the window. "Give it time." The SUV turned down a side street, pulling up in front of a discreet, upscale building. Security was already in place, keeping the press and onlookers at bay. Snoop stepped out, adjusting his coat as cameras flashed in the distance. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He headed inside, Trey and Angie close behind. Upstairs in a private lounge, they waited. The energy in the room was charged, everyone knowing they were in the eye of the storm. Then, the door opened, and Captain Monroe walked in alone. No uniform, just a simple suit, her NYPD badge clipped to her belt. "Appreciate you coming," Snoop said, standing as she entered. She nodded, sitting across from him. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet." There was a moment of silence. Then Monroe leaned forward. "I'm not here to defend Martinez," she said. "His actions were inexcusable." Snoop nodded, but said nothing. "But I need you to understand something," she continued. "The system doesn't just move because people get mad online. It takes more than outrage. It takes action." Snoop exhaled slowly. "So, what are you saying?" Monroe's gaze was steady. "If we're going to use this moment to make real change, we have to be smart about it. You have a voice, an audience. But I have access. And if we work together, we might be able to push this further than just trending hashtags." Trey shifted uncomfortably, but Snoop remained unreadable. "And what do you want out of this?" Monroe leaned back. "I want my department to do better. And I know that won't happen unless we're forced to." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Snoop smirked. "Now we talking."